2021 ends, and though it was a dick bag of a year, I am also grateful because I was luckier than most. My work wasn't impacted, our lockdowns were tolerable because I lived near parks with workout equipment and near my friends, and I also dedicated a lot of the excess time I had towards reading. As the title suggests, I read 33 books this year across a range of non-fiction and fiction, but mostly fiction and fantasy, and I'm eager to give you a rapid-fire review of these titles now. I'm not doing a face cam because I'm currently lacking an aesthetic streamer YouTuber setup, and since these are books, I don't really have any interesting visuals I can put on the screen, so I've decided to run generic gaming footage in the background, but it's all irrelevant, so I encourage you to treat this like a podcast. Go for a walk, fold your laundry, do something that'll free up your time later. I haven't scripted anything for this video, so it's really just going to be me summarizing and rambling. So with that, I hope you enjoy listening to the 33 books that I read this year. The first up is the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. These 3 books I'm hoping to actually have an entire video dedicated towards, so I'm not going to spend nearly the time that they deserve now speaking about them. But what I will say is that these books have rekindled for me a love of fantasy. They remind me why I love epic stories about feuding nations with conflicting political systems and characters who are put in these different spectrums who otherwise might get along, but because of their upbringing are now butting heads. In broad strokes, First Law tells the story of a conflict between the Union, being a European-esque colonial power, versus one of its colonies in the north, and then a broader, longer war against Gurkul, which is this Islamic-inspired Middle Eastern powerhouse, the banks of the Union versus the temples and churches of Gurkul. It's interesting enough, if not somewhat generic, and obviously has a lot of historical influences to it, Joe Abercrombie being a lover of history himself. But what really sells it are the personal stories of all the prospective characters. You have Jezel, a proud, snobbish young officer who is absolutely the worst kind of person, racist, sexist, difficult to deal with, but he also has a redeeming feature in that he is a brilliant duelist, and that's what carries him into the group and triggers his somewhat redemptive arc throughout the narrative, which is probably one of my favorite ones to watch. There is also Logan Ninefingers, a barbarian from the north, who is probably one of the greatest characters ever put to fantasy fiction. He is probably in his late 30s, early 40s, and he's already lost his family, lost most of his friends, and so when he reflects on his violent past and all the evil that he's done, he's very mournful, but also just sensible and calculated. He'll admit that he was scared, that he almost pissed himself in a fight, but then he'll also be the one who explodes into violence and causes the most havoc. Glotka is the third main character, an inquisitor for the Union, literally makes a career out of torturing people. But when he's embroiled into the political conflict, we see that he has a stronger moral foundation and more reservations that were initially led on. There are even more perspective characters, but this isn't my full review here, so I'll leave it at that. For me, First Law was probably one of the highlights of the year. The first book, The Blade itself, is quite slow to start, and I almost didn't continue the rest of the series having finished it. It was only really a 3 out of 10 for me. But when I got into the second book, Before They Are Hanged, I read that in maybe 2 or 3 days. I was so hooked by them. Easily a 5 out of 5 for me. The final book, Last Argument of Kings, is a little bloated, and you get fatigued by all the battles and all the conflict, but it is definitely a climax and a conclusion to the story. And for me, that was probably a 4 out of 5. So on the whole, I think it is a brilliant series. If you are like me and read a lot of fantasy growing up as a teenager and have kind of left the genre for a while, I think it is a great way to jump into the deep end and probably enjoy it once again. Next up is Yukio Mishima, the sailor who fell from grace with the sea. Mishima is a very interesting person, and I read a lot of him this year, so he will come up quite frequently. All I'll say is that as a complicated person, I think we can separate his personal beliefs from his beautiful prose and his really interesting stories that just explore human relationships and anxiety and sex and self-loathing and all these complicated feelings that people have. But Mishima himself was unapologetically a fascist. He was an extreme right-wing nutcase who believed in fealty to the emperor at a point in Japanese history in like the 60s and 70s when most people were really over this. So in Japan, he was looked at himself as a kind of eccentric, bizarre person. But his book, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, is a very simple story in a seaside town. Ryuji is a sailor, no longer a young man, who often glorified himself and the sea and what he could accomplish in his life. But as he becomes involved with a single mother and her child, he has to reassess himself and acknowledge that he's probably not going to achieve everything he wanted. Now, while we have that romance going on, we have some very creepy and ominous developments with that only child, Noboru, who, along with his friends, are becoming radicalized with their nihilism, and they're starting to act out in violent ways towards animals, for example. And this all leads towards a very disturbing climax that, although very unsettling, has one of the best final lines I have ever read to a book in fiction. The entire book itself is okay. I think I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads, so I recommend it if you want some interesting Japanese literature with some beautiful descriptions of a seaside village in spring and summer and with the ocean and the ships in the dockyard. But on the whole, I wasn't incredibly moved by this story. Next is Metamorphosis and Other Collected Works by Kafka. If you haven't read Kafka, it is normally a very interesting, surreal, almost hallucinogenic experience because he writes in very obvious metaphors to get his message across. And Metamorphosis is, you've probably heard of it, a story where a young man wakes up as a bug one day. And suddenly, obviously, his life is very changed. He can't really leave his room in his house, and he has to deal with the discrimination and the disgust and the absolute lack of empathy his family now gives towards him as he is a disgusting bug. It's 40 or 50 pages. You can knock it out in an hour or two, and it's probably worth reading just so that you've read this classic that is so often referenced in media and pop culture. The second story that is probably worth mentioning in the collected works is In the Penal Colony, and I think it shows Kafka's fascination with torture and self-loathing because it deals with this man who goes to this penal colony and he's being shown off this very slow, excruciating execution device. And it just ends up being this very bizarre situation where the man initially condemned to be killed is taken off, and the officer who was so in love with this device willingly puts himself on it. It's hard to articulate exactly what I think the meaning of this story was, but Kafka to me seems to be somebody who was fascinated with justice and power and the dynamic between individuals and the state and the right to try and execute people. And I think his book The Trial, which after reading all these still remains my favorite novel of his, I think that is the story probably where he articulates his fascination but also his horror best of all. But yep, Metamorphosis and Other Works I think got 3 stars from me. If you're seeing a trend now, if I don't know what to do with a book or I don't feel strongly with it, I just give it 3 stars. Alright, next is Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, and there is a lot of controversy around this book in Australian media at the moment. Some people want it taken off bookshelves, people want it revoked. I'm not really in a position to go into all the commentary. But fundamentally, this is a book by an Indigenous man, Bruce Pascoe, and he is shining a light on what he thinks are parts of Australian history that can be retold to reflect better on the Indigenous people of Australia, because throughout his quite short non-fiction book, he shows how there were actually more sophisticated technologies and techniques and ways of governing society than we give Indigenous people credit for. He spends a long time going over common myths that Indigenous people were never farming, that they never had any agriculture, and he shows through what are often colonial records and letters and journals, what is meant to be proof that Indigenous people were in fact farming and having fish rings and were engaging with pottery and other aspects of technology that we would associate with sophisticated societies. Since its publication, some of the claims have been debated and others might have been debunked. I haven't really engaged with the controversy around it because I just wanted to read the book and see if I like, regardless of if some of the truth is stretched or not. I just really quite enjoyed it because I thought it was interesting to read all these colonial letters and all these journals from explorers in the outback of Australia from the 1800s that, frankly, I've never really engaged with before. And it was fascinating, and I really liked some of the exploration with the indigenous mythos in combination with some of these agricultural techniques they had. I found it quite enjoyable. Again, it was probably 3 stars from me just because non-fiction is often hard for me to really throw myself into and love in the same way that I might with a thriller book or a fantasy book. But Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu to me was quite a nice read. After that, I read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I'm not really sure how to pronounce any of these. It's an old story by a Soviet-Russian author. And I believe this is a story that got him in trouble. It might have gotten him thrown into the gulag. But essentially, this is a story that gives you a snapshot of one day of a man in a Russian gulag and the experience they had. Essentially, if you've seen a Holocaust movie or anything with concentration camps in Japan or Russia or Germany or westernized countries, then you really know what this story is about. It is about suffering in an internment camp, not getting much food, getting overworked, and then some of the relationships and dynamics that you have with other people, the prisoners, the guards, the chefs. It's a mildly interesting story. Again, not to beat a dead horse, I would have given this 3 stars. I think I bought it because it was a Penguin classic, had the orange cover, and would look nice on my bookshelf. So again, interesting if you want to have a first-hand account of what it was for somebody to be in a Russian gulag, but again, I don't think your life is going to be absent if you pass over this book. Next, we have more Joe Abercrombie with the First Law standalone books. These are 3 books that follow the ending of the First Law trilogy over a period of about 20-25 years that finally lead into Joe Abercrombie's new trilogy, I believe called The Age of Madness. I haven't read that trilogy yet, but I have read these standalone books to prepare me for reading that over the Christmas break. The common sentiment towards these 3 standalone books is that they are better than the original trilogy, and I found that so hard to believe because how could 3 disconnected standalone books be better than an original trilogy in a fantasy universe? But I read these books and I have to agree, they are so tightly written and interesting and a natural expansion of characters we already know and the universe at large. The core characters from the original trilogy, those perspective characters, do not return. Instead, what we get are characters who were on the sides, on the periphery, who were known in reference, appearing as perspective characters in these standalone books. And that is so cool because in the original trilogy, we either didn't like them at all, knew very little about them, but by the end of these books, they are so well fleshed out and more interesting than the original characters. Again, I like to think that I'm going to eventually do my own unique reviews for Joe Abercrombie's work, so I won't bang on about this for too long, but instead I'll just give you a rapid-fire summary of each book. The first was probably my favorite, Best Served Cold. This is a revenge thriller in the vein of Count of Monte Cristo. Monza Mercado is our female lead, and she is left for dead, her brother murdered at the start of the book. And for the rest of the 6 or 7 sections of the book, we see her hunting down, murdering the people who have wronged her, and slowly collecting characters and accomplices as she goes along. But what is so great is that there is a really good reverse arc between her and one of her companions, Shivers, where Shivers starts off trying to be a good man but falls further and further into darkness and violence, whereas Monza herself starts off hateful and revengeful because she was wronged so brutally, but throughout the course of the story, by the 3rd or 4th person that she deals with, she really seems to start regretting her actions and wondering if she should be abandoning her revenge quest, which is something that I feel like rarely happens that early in a revenge story. But yep, I read this in maybe 2 or 3 days. I just soared through the pages. I was hooked from beginning to end, utterly loved it. The next standalone is The Heroes, and this again has some fantastic recurring characters from both previously in the original trilogy and then also in Best Served Cold, one of the core characters returns. Fundamentally, this is a war story, and not in the sense that Lord of the Rings or other fantasy stories have a lot of battles in them, but this book, from beginning to end, reads like a non-fiction historical account, almost, but with a lot of character and drama thrown in. It has great maps, lists of all the armies with their officers and chains of command, and the book to me seems to be such a commentary on the futility of war because so much goes wrong in the chains of command, and there are so many miscommunications that have people dying for silly reasons, and typically by the end of the story we're left with a feeling wondering if any of this was worth it to begin with. The final standalone is Red Country. It has, again, characters returning, which is fantastic to see. And it interestingly tells this Western story where the world is industrializing. There is gold in the mountains and coal, and people are starting to set up wagons and carriages heading off into the frontier lands to go mining and trying their luck. And along the way, there are these characters who are very reminiscent of the marauding Native American tribes who would have been haranguing the gold diggers, I presume, in America's gold rush era. But it's such a fantastic story because, again, it's character driven. It has these neat little segments that divide the story really nicely. I think Red Country is probably people's least favorite of the standalones, but I, again, really enjoyed it. Joe Abercrombie just does such a good job at delivering you solid characters who, even if you only know them for one book, they feel so real, they're so flawed, they make so many mistakes, they're so violent and awful to each other. It was such a fun read, so it was probably a 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on, we are back to Yukio Mishima with Confessions of a Mask. This book, again, is very interesting as it is set in the World War II period in Tokyo, and it effectively tells the story of a young man who is dealing with his repressed homosexuality, and a lot of people suspect that this is what Mishima himself was actually dealing with in his everyday life. The book takes us from early childhood, where the boy is fascinated with men and masculinity and concepts of dying with honor and glory and violence and all these sorts of concepts that he can't quite articulate as sexual longing. Later, as a young man, he works as I think in a factory repairing planes, something to that effect. And while he strikes up a relationship with a woman, the story centers around how he and her will never truly be able to satisfy each other and help each other. So ultimately, this is another Mishima book that is a classic character study. If you are open to reading a book that is not plot intensive, but rather spends a lot of its time on beautiful descriptions and retrospective thoughts on, honestly, homosexual longing, then you'll probably find some enjoyment from it. But it might not be for everyone, but again, probably 3 or 4 stars from me. Alright, and now we are moving back to fantasy YA genre with Garth Nix's Sabriel, Lirael, and Abhorsen. These 3 books tell a somewhat connected story that, again, I hope to do a whole video dedicated towards, so I won't go full intense in my description here, but what I will say is that I love the concept of what Garth Nix has built here. The writing is passable, it's okay. Compared to the prose of Mishima, it's nothing close to that standard. But the concept of what Garth Nix has built here is so cool. These books make heroes or protagonists out of necromancers, or to be precise, reverse necromancers. These people with magical powers who can walk through death and banish spirits and zombies and the walking dead as they try to come back into the living. And the description of how they do it is really cool because it is not just Harry Potter-esque saying magical words, weaving spells, but it is a lot more of a spiritual magical experience where the protagonist will have certain bells that can do certain charms and tricks, and then they will walk into depth. They will enter a new dimension and walk through this icy river, and I always found that so visually compelling, the thought of being in this rushing current of death and water merged together, that they're hoping to banish the spirit, but they also have to care for themselves because the currents of life and death could easily sweep them along. To summarize my thoughts on these books, I think Sabriel was probably the best. It is a tight standalone book about Sabriel, this girl who was hunting down her father and just trying to save the day. It has a very generic love story attached, and it has a few okay side characters. But for the most part, I think if I'd read that book as a teenager, I would have loved it. Lirael is a much longer book, and it probably has better characterization of the protagonist. It has a dual protagonist system, sort of, but the male counterpart, Sameth, is a whole lot less interesting. But also, I think Garth struggled here because this and Abhorsen were initially meant to be one book, but it grew too long, and so he had to split them in two. And unfortunately, it seems like he couldn't find a perfect place to do it, so it ends on this okay cliffhanger, but it means Abhorsen is this quite short book that is mostly climax intense battling with little characterization still going on. So I would actually rank these books in their order of appearance. Sabriel is probably 4 stars, 3 stars, it's quite interesting. Lirael is 3 to 4 stars, less tight, but still a good story. And then Abhorsen, I think, was 2 stars. I found it to be an okay conclusion to everything, but on the whole, not the sort of definitive conclusion or resolution I would hope to an epic fantasy series. Next is Obernewtyn by Isobelle Carmody. This tells the story of people with telekinetic powers in this post-war, post-radiation society. On the whole, I think it was an okay story. I do concede, I readily admit that I only picked it up because it was a Penguin Classic book with the typical orange cover. But for the most part, it is a decent story. Had I read it as a teenager, again, I probably would have liked it more. On the one hand, it is a little cliche, the whole concept of a post-radiation society, telekinetic people who are oppressed by this overlooming state, but of course, the state is also using these powers themselves. There's a lot of generic ideas here, but some of the things I really did like was that the protagonist could talk to animals, which meant that you actually had a more exciting and engaging suite of side characters. The mystery of Obernewtyn, the school and the prison that the protagonist ends up being put in, is somewhat compelling. But again, the villains, the antagonists, do end up being quite cliched. No exciting motivations other than power and control and oppressing people in society. So all I'll say is that even though I enjoyed this book, it is part of a series. I think the author actually wrote quite a lot of these, but I have no intention of finishing the series. Again, it was probably a 2 to 3 stars for me, but if you are somebody who likes YA, the concept of telekinesis is interesting to you, then you'll probably enjoy it. Next is a total change of pace with Marie Darrieussecq Undercurrents. This is your typical sort of literary fiction that is a little wanky, a little snobby. It's a very thin book that is just prose that is beautifully written, but the narrative and the characters aren't entirely fleshed out. It is that sort of postmodern, ephemeral kind of story that is really hard to engage with authentically, I find, for someone like me who just loves your sort of classic story with a 3-act structure and a hero's journey. No, Undercurrents is a lot more inaccessible than that, but generally it is telling the story of a woman who takes her child and flees across the Spanish border, but we have a intersecting story of a detective looking for her. It sounds like something that could be really interesting as a thriller, but like most literary fiction, it feels like a lot of the joy and tension and life is kind of sucked out of it so that it is more poetical and more metaphorical. That said, again, it is beautifully written and it's really short, so it's the sort of book that you can read through and push through just for the enjoyment of what it is as a piece of art. I will say that I only know about these books because Marie Darrieussecq, a French author, was at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and I heard her speak at a panel, and I just thought she was a really cool person. So I bought the book, I spoke to her very briefly and had her sign it. So that was a fun experience for me, but I do concede that had I not met her, had I not seen her speak at the Writers' Festival, I probably wouldn't have picked this up. But again, you might enjoy it. I think this was once again a 2 to 3 stars out of 5 for me. Sticking with the French theme, the next book I will talk about is The Plague by Albert Camus. I've read a lot of books by Albert Camus. I really like him. I love his themes of not quite nihilism, but absurdism, just highlighting the absurdity of everyday life and just how crazy and banal but interesting but perplexing our world is. I think he's a lot of fun, and I really recommend all his other books. I say all his other books because even though The Plague is one of his more famous novels, I actually didn't particularly enjoy it. And maybe that's because I read it in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I thought that I would find some sort of sadistic enjoyment reading a story about a town in France that is beset by a plague that is brought by rats, and having the town locked down, quarantined, and then the story of the lives of the people within that town. I thought this would be really good and really interesting for me, but it was a slog. I really struggled to get through it, so I think it ended up being 2 out of 5 for me. What I will say though is that Camus really perfectly captured what it is to be in isolation, what it is to be in lockdown in a town, from the sense of hopelessness that pervades everyone and everything, the empty streets with the cafes that used to be alive but are now turned upside down with empty chairs and seats, that people are just mindlessly walking the street because they have nothing else to do, that people are turning to religion surprisingly, that people are having these gatherings in their homes illicitly because they are so desperate for connection. He captured so many aspects that felt so real, but I just found it awful to read because, I don't know, the narrative wasn't gripping me, and probably it wasn't the right thing to read during lockdown. What I will do though is read a brief snippet where I think Camus perfectly captured the effects of a plague on collective consciousness. This is what Camus wrote in one chapter. The first thing the plague brought to our fellow citizens was exile. Yes, that hollow that we carried constantly inside us, that unreasonable desire to go backwards, or, on the contrary, speed up the march of time, those burning arrows of memory. All this really did amount to a feeling of exile." End quote. I think that just perfectly captured lockdown for me. The fact that on the one hand, you wish you could get that remote from that Adam Sandler movie where you can just fast forward through time. But on the other hand, you also just wanted everything to stop, to go backwards to how it was. It feels like you're living in a paradoxical in-between state. So I won't muse any more on COVID or pandemics or lockdowns, but again, I think this is a really good book. I do recommend it, even though I didn't particularly enjoy it. It might just be that it needs to be read in a different context. Next is The 39 Steps by John Buchan. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Effectively, this is a thriller book that was written in 1915. Again, predictably, I picked this up because it was an Orange Penguins classic. But I found the book so funny because it is effectively a century-old equivalent of a modern James Bond flick. It is a thriller story about Richard Hannay, who has just returned from England and is really bored and stultified with London until a murder just happens to happen in his apartment, and this is committed by people who are doing something very evil that is prejudicial to the United Kingdom as a whole. And Richard is on the run, and he's always swapping with people, stealing cars, taking people's jobs so that the antagonists drive by. It's very silly, very action heavy, and he's always picking up allies along the way until he eventually, through athleticism and intelligence and sheer will, he manages to save the day. Altogether, it's a silly book, and again, it's probably 3 stars out of 5 for me. And it's hard to recommend, but it is such a perfect snapshot in time, because my favorite thing about the book is not actually within the story itself. It is from this author's foreword, where John Buchan is writing to Thomas Arthur Nelson. And in this letter, he's essentially writing that he and his friend Tom have always loved these American books that are known as dime novels, also called a shocker. And he describes it as the romance where the incidents defy the probabilities and march just inside the borders of possible. And he wrote this book because he thought that it was such a wild kind of fiction that anyone could write one, including himself. And he penned this, and it ended up being one of the more famous ones at the time. I just think that's so funny that somebody was really a big fan of these action adventure stories and just smashed one out himself, and it became kind of famous. I think he wrote lots and lots of these books. I won't read any more of them. If you like 100-year-old action adventure stories, then perhaps you will enjoy it. It's really short, only probably about 130 pages, so yep. Again, 3 stars from me, not much else to say. Following this is another non-fiction, Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. It took me probably 2 years to actually finish this book. I read the first half of it really quickly in a few days, but I just kind of got bored of it and left it collecting dust, so I only happened to finish it this year. It is a follow-up to Sapiens, where Yuval talks about humankind in its development stages and how all these aspects of our culture and biological makeup, and more importantly, our sociology, led to today. Homo Deus is actually forward-looking, envisioning a future where humans are trying to become gods through technology and new social systems. On the whole, it is a pretty interesting book, but I think Yuval often straddles this line a bit too cheekily between pseudoscience and speculation. So you have to sort of read it with a grain of salt and not take everything that is said as gospel. And that's all I'm going to say about this book. Again, probably 3 stars for me, take it or leave it. But I have to concede now that I did in fact read more than 33 books this year. I actually read 35, and I'm telling you this now because when I put Yuval Homo Deus on my Goodreads, it's actually because I also finished alongside it some middle grade fiction books written for children, but I didn't want to put them on my Goodreads. I only put Homo Deus up. So, very, very briefly, these 2 children books were, firstly, Ranger's Apprentice by, I believe, John Flanagan. I love these books as kids, and I reread the first one because at the moment, what is taking up the bulk of my time after work is not YouTube videos, which is why there has been such a dearth of them lately, but rather trying to write my own middle grade fiction novels. So Ranger's Apprentice was really helpful for that, for just recapturing some of the language and the writing techniques. So that was a fun trip down memory lane. They were really big in Australia. I'm not sure if they were as big globally. Secondly was an Emily Rodda book. Emily Rodda is massive in Australia, millions of copies, and I believe she has very good global reach as well. I grew up reading Del Toro Quest. I reread Del Toro Quest last year in preparation for throwing myself into the deep end for writing my own middle grade fiction stories. In this instance, I actually read something new of hers, Teen Power Inc. Beware the Gingerbread House. So you know this is some ripping good stuff. Essentially, she wrote about 20 books about a group of kids who take on odd jobs, but of course, in each job they take on, there is some antagonist, some villain, some corruption, some criminal underlying aspect that is going on, and the kids will band together and, like Scooby-Doo, save the day. This was actually a good book. Like, middle grade fiction is so easy to read, and I actually have a middle grade fiction book I'll be talking about soon on this list. Because you have 100 pages, it's very digestible, it's often very lean, so you have very simple beats and plot cues to follow. I won't talk about this any longer, but yeah, these were the 2 books, Ranger's Apprentice and Teen Power Inc., which weren't on my list, but I also read this year. As a nice juxtaposition, following that we have Noam Chomsky, Global Discontents. I really enjoyed this. This was 4 out of 5 stars for me. And even though I love history and I love politics, normally I find it hard to engage with a dense 400 to 500 page book that is just slabs of text with no life in them. This is very, very different. It is a collection of interviews where Noam Chomsky is just answering questions on these very complicated topics. If you don't know Noam Chomsky, he's probably most famous for manufacturing consent. For a lot of people, he's probably too radical. But what I really enjoy is that often in his writings, he comes across as so reasonable in just breaking down the issues and explaining why global superpowers, and in particular United States hegemony, is making it so difficult to solve these things. So I'm cheating here, I'm holding the contents page in front of me, but the topics that he covers are spying and democracy, the Middle East in general, fear-mongering, the roots of conflict, elections and voting, the Trump presidency, and other aspects of, our miserable society. Again, I find it hard to read about politics just in a usual nonfiction, but because these are a collection of interviews, I just found it so easy to engage with, and that's probably because he's going into far less detail than a normal book would, so you're probably getting less actual information out of it. But for a rapid fire summary and explanation and insight into a lot of complicated issues, this is a really cool non-fiction book to read. I really do recommend it. Next up is an interesting one. It's sort of a romance, sort of a character exploration. It is Kent Harrouff's Our Souls at Night, and this has sat on my bookshelf for years and years, and I don't remember how it got there, if I bought it, if somebody bought it for me, but I picked it up this year and I read through it quite quickly, and I really did enjoy it. It is actually one of my favorite books from this year, and I find that surprising because the subject matter is on its face so boring. I remember reading the blurb every year when I would think about reading it and just thinking, nah, putting it down. It is effectively a romance story about two quite old people, I believe in their 70s, who, because they have both lost a partner, end up striking up a relationship. And it's a very sweet relationship because it starts by this old woman coming to the main character's house and just telling him that they're both single, they're both alone, they're both going to die soon, they may as well sleep together. And not sexually, she means just lie together at night. So what this book ends up being is really just their conversations as they reflect on their entire lives together while they lie prone together on their beds together in the dead of night, just talking and sharing their experiences, their politics, their thoughts, their children, everything. And it ends up, of course, naturally developing into a more sincere romance that gets complicated when their children get involved and people in the town they live in don't approve. It is a very sweet, slow-moving story. Slow is a good word to describe it, but it is not slow in the way that the Mishima books are slow because the plot moves so slowly. It's slow because the characters are old and tired and they know better about the world and they're so slow moving, and that really comes across in the very peaceful, slow, delightful Hemingway-esque writing. So I really did quite enjoy this. It's not going to be for everyone, but again, it was probably one of the highlights of what I read this year. So again, I would say 4 stars out of 5 from me. Following that, we have Tracy Baptiste's The Jumbies, and this is the middle grade fiction book that I was talking about that actually made it onto my Goodreads because I knew that nobody else would know what it was and it wouldn't detract from my clout and how people would perceive my list. I'm being kind of serious here, that's why I declared it. This is a book that is so brilliant. I'm so glad I read this, and it kind of transformed in my mind how good a middle grade fiction book can be. Books that are written for 9 to 12 year olds, but you read it as an adult and you get something from it. You appreciate the beauty of the writing, the finesse of how the character arcs are handled, and just the plotting. Everything about this book is fantastic. If we had to put it in a genre, we would call it a fantasy book, but it separates itself from the usual tradition of European folklore and instead focuses on Caribbean culture. And the story is so personal because it is about a young girl who has lost her mother, but in the forest near her village where she lives, there are jumbies, monsters that, of course, cliche at the beginning people don't believe in, but these monsters start becoming stirred up and leaving the forest because essentially the protagonist's mother was a jumbie and her sister has returned, and the author changes perspective from the protagonist to this jumbie, this demonic creature from the forest. And when she writes from that perspective, she does it so beautifully. It is so creepy. It is like a horror movie, the way she describes how the monsters move and crawl across the ground, how its tears explode into centipedes on the dirt. Every aspect of it, even the way the jumbies talk, is sold to be so creepy and unsettling. I think had I read this at 9 years old, I might have had nightmares because it's a little unsettling. But I think, for the most part, anybody over the age of, say, 10 will read it and just get a really exciting story. I don't plan on reading the others because, again, I read this book more to study the craft of writing junior fiction books. But were I a teenager, were I a child, I would have been begging my mother to go out and buy the rest of the trilogy because these books are so solid, they're so interesting, and it's also exciting that books of Caribbean folklore, which I'm not familiar with, are now becoming commercialized and sold. So again, fantastic book if you want to read a children's story. Next up, we have another old piece of literature, As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. Oh my freaking god, I hated this book. 1 star, it was my least favorite of the year. This is the story of a family that comes together as the matriarch passes away, and I believe that they have to organize either her funeral or her cremation. I'll be honest, it's hard for me to remember at this point. And on paper, this should actually be a really interesting book with very compelling character studies, because for an old book, I believe this was written in the 1800s, you have different character perspectives, and you have all these different characters, their viewpoints, and how they're interacting with each other, and how they're dealing with the grief and the other aspects of a massive family death. The thing is, though, there are so many characters. There were way too many character perspectives early on. I couldn't tell people apart. It moved very slowly, and I just could not become gripped by the story. After I was maybe 50 pages in, I really just started to speed read it to get through it. I did not enjoy this, but I can concede that there is probably some literary merit to this. I'm sure if you read a literary dissection on the internet, or if you read this along with a book club, I'm sure you could probably break down some very interesting aspects to the story, writing techniques, characterization, what's happening with the viewpoints and perspectives. But for me, I wasn't gripped by it, so I can't recommend it. Next is our final dose of Yukio Mishima for the year, being his Sea of Fertility Tetralogy. This is a series of 4 books written by this very controversial man I spoke about earlier, and after completing the 4th book in this tetralogy, he committed seppuku, ritual suicide, by cutting out his stomach with a blade. So you would hope for his sake that this is an exquisite, unrivaled series of books. Well, honestly, it kind of is. Many people regard it as the perfect series of books that represents Japan in the period between 1900 and 1950, the first half of the 20th century, where Japan is modernizing, styling itself after Western imperial powers, radicalizing, and finally becoming a fascist country in which it enters World War II, and then the aftermath, the recovery from the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The story, even though it is ancillary, captures so much background of the environment, the milieu, the sentiment that was Japan in this period of time. And if you're interested in Japanese history and you want to be exposed to the sentiment and the emotion and the fervor that was Japan in 1900 to 1950, then you simply have to read this series. The concept of these books is really innovative, and it's something you would almost expect from a modernist author instead of somebody who was writing 50 years ago. The story is that a young man, Kiyoyaki, in the first book, Spring Snow, dies at the end of the book, but reincarnates in every subsequent story over 4 books. That sounds like a spoiler, telling you that a main character dies, but this isn't actually a surprise in the story, because he seems doomed to die, because he is self-destructive and he is apathetic and he disregards everything other than purity. And purity is the theme of these books, because again, even though I hope to have a video dedicated to these books, what you will find out is that each reincarnation of this character is dedicated to something else. In the first book, Spring Snow, our protagonist is dedicated to love and romance and a purity of emotion and being true to himself. The second book, Runaway Horses, is where it gets really exciting, because in his reincarnated form as Isao, I believe it's pronounced, is essentially a radical right-wing fanatic who is dedicated to the emperor and the concept of dying honorably in combat and assassinating the capitalist who he believes is degenerating and bespoiling Japan. In the third book, this character is reincarnated as a Thai princess, which gets a little bit weird because all these books are framed by the character's best friend from the first book, Honda, who every 20 or so years comes across this reincarnation of his friend, and he tries to help him and be involved in his life. But in the third book, Temple of Dawn, he kind of wants to bang his best friend. He becomes obsessed and lustful over this Thai princess. It is more complicated than that, of course, so don't judge it by that alone. But what should excite you to read this book is how compelling the narrative technique of having an essential character dying each book and being reincarnated, because it means that characters who were side characters and peripheral in, say, the first book become essential in the second book because they might be the protagonist's father or their tutor or their best friend. Characters who were so peripheral and so disconnected from events in earlier books weave their way back in. And even if they don't become essential, it's so interesting to see how, say, a love interest in the second book becomes a famous poet in the third book, or how an old maid in the first book is still alive and kicking in the third book and is a useful character. I can't reiterate how modern this feels. I would expect this from almost a YA author or a popular fiction author today, but to see such dedicated narrative techniques that almost feel like fan service, bringing back these characters who the audience want to see, it just feels so unlike anything I've ever read from this time period. So again, I really love the Tetralogy. I've only read the first 3 books, Spring Snow, Runaway Horses, and Temple of Dawn. I have the final book ready to read in the new year, but if you want to read Yukio Mishima and you also want to understand more about Japan, then I can't recommend this Tetralogy enough. Again, it does verge on being a little weird, a little creepy at times, but the literary value and the insight into Japan in the first half of the 20th century is unreal. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. So again, this series as a whole for me is a 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5 as a whole. I can't recommend it enough. Next up is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. I had only ever seen the movie and I wasn't familiar with how the book differed. So the most shocking thing to me was how the book essentially has an epilogue, this extra chapter that shows you what happens after where Stanley Kubrick's film ends. And the message is actually entirely different and in a way a little bit hopeful and also a little bit darker and fatalistic. Fundamentally, it is a story about Alex, who is obsessed and involved with ultra-violence and who is unshakable in his dedication to this way of life. It's a dystopian world, and when Alex is caught by the government and subject to special treatment, interesting questions about free will, justice, and rehabilitation arise. One of the more interesting things about the book is so much of it is written in a quasi-English Russian language known as Nazdat, and it takes a while to push through that. You won't like it at first, but by the end, you're able to sort of read it and understand it, what's being communicated. So an interesting book. I think it's worth reading, particularly if you've seen the film and you thought it was interesting commentary. So this would be 3 or 4 stars from me. I'm glad I read it, and it will always stay on my bookshelf. Alright, Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. I have never read an Agatha Christie novel before, and I don't think I've even seen one of her films before, say Murder on the Orient Express. But Death on the Nile was developed into a movie quite recently, so I would like to see that. And I believe this is also one of her more famous novels. I picked it up in Dimmicks because I just wanted more exposure to the crime genre. And really, it was your classic crime novel with your suite of characters and this sort of travelogue aspect of all these families meeting together, journeying down the Nile on a river crawler. There's not much to say in the way of prose, for example. It's not beautiful writing like Yukio Mishima. It's clean, it's palatable, and the characters are interesting enough to service the plot. More than anything, I think you read these books trying to outsmart the author, wondering if you can understand what's happening ahead of how the events are unfolding. I will freely admit that trying my hardest, analysing everything, I couldn't pick the murderer, even though there were only a few possible options. So kudos to Agatha, she told a compelling murder mystery. I couldn't guess how it would end. And yeah, decent way to while away a few hours, so I would say 3.5 stars. Next is an interesting one that I don't think any of you would have read or even be that interested in, but it's called No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, and effectively it is, you couldn't even call it a novel, but it is almost like poetry. It is this collection of scattered ideas with only a mild narrative thread that sort of blooms out towards the end, about the internet and how the internet impacts us and how we act on the internet and how we interpret it and just how crazy it is and what it does to people. And it fundamentally is more of a comedy than anything. It is a really funny book that is just trying to capture the essence of what it is to be online and to be immersed in internet culture and subgroups. I listened to this book as an audiobook because a friend gave me access to their Audible. And I think if you want to experience this, that is how you should do it, because it's only short, maybe 4 hours to listen to. And that is probably how it should be experienced, because the voice acting is brilliant. And it kind of is, again, like poetry. It should be read aloud. I ended up buying the paperback version afterwards because it is just so funny and interesting to thumb through. Even right now, I've got it open to a page and it says, "Call out culture. Were things rapidly approaching the point where even you could be seen as bad?" Or just one page later, "Shoot it in my veins," we said, whenever the headline was too perfect, the juxtaposition too good to be true. "Shoot it in my veins," we said, when the Flat Earth Society announced it had members all over the globe. Really, I guess as a millennial, as somebody who's grown up with the internet, it's just so funny to see somebody try their darndest to articulate the internet and the experience that we've all had with it. So yeah, it's esoteric and it's interesting and it's funny. It's not your traditional narrative, which is what I normally love to read. It is more poetical and stream of consciousness. So if you want something new and interesting to read, I really do recommend it. I, again, would say 3.5 stars. Following that, we have Luckies by Andrew Pipos. Full disclosure, this is biased from me because Andrew Pipos is actually family. The good news is this is actually an objectively good book. It was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Prize, which in Australia is a very big deal. The writing is fantastic. It's a work of fiction, but the prose is just poetical when it needs to be. It's short and curt when it needs to be. The characters are fantastic, particularly in the middle portion. So this is a story about Greek immigration and Greek assimilation in Australia using the vehicle of what used to be very common in New South Wales, the Greek cafe scene. And Luckies tells the story of a young man post-World War II trying his luck with the cafes and becoming embroiled with an early Greek family, launching his own franchise and having the rise and fall of this. It's a modern day epic. It's really good. And again, the characters are really good, particularly in the middle section where Lucky is wedded and he joins this eccentric Greek family. As a Greek person myself, he perfectly captures sort of the stubbornness and the eccentricity and the drama and the overdramatic nature of sort of older Greek people. I really loved it. So it's an enthralling story. It's beautifully written. On Goodreads, I gave it 5 out of 5 to support my family on the algorithm, but literally it, for me, would be one of the best books I read this year. I can't recommend it enough. Okay, we are getting close to closing out this list. Again, we have another Australian author here with Charlotte Wood and her premier book, The Children. I've read other books by Charlotte Wood. I still think the best thing she has written that I've read so far is The Natural Way of Things. Charlotte Wood is quite famous in the Australian literary community because her writing is very simple but beautiful and elegant, and the characters that she writes are complicated and nuanced. The Children, though, is kind of just a boring story. It tells a tale of a father who injures himself and is dying in hospital, and these different children from across the world really come back, reunite in the small town village over their father. And we get the characterization of these characters, and we get some dark secrets of their past. So it's well written, but it doesn't have the narrative drive, the active characters, the excitement and the pathos that some of Charlotte's other books do. And I think this does feel like a first novel. It feels a little amateur compared to what she's done later. So I can't really recommend this one. It's probably a 2 to 3 stars for me, but I do like reading Australian authors and trying to support that community. Alright, next is a book I'm excited to talk about. It is Books of Blood, volumes 1 to 3 by Clive Barker. I adore Clive Barker. I just think he is one of the greatest horror writers ever. I think he's better than Stephen King, but it's hard to compare them because they do fundamentally very different stories. Clive Barker is more fantasy focused, more otherworldly, more mystical. And so as somebody who loves to read fantasy, that is why Clive Barker to me is just one of the greatest. In Magica, one of my favorite books of all time. This here are his short stories, and they're very different because Clive even admits in a foreword that his novels are normally quite hopeful, and they have, if not happy endings, then satisfying endings, and endings that are hopeful and optimistic for the future. These short stories are very different. They're often very brutal. Your protagonist often ends up broken or destroyed or their mind in ruins. He has so many fantastic stories here. They're bloody, they're gory, but as an experienced short story writer, Clive Barker is just able to, in a very short amount of time, give you an active character who has a very compelling voice, who has simple goals, and then give you this horrible antagonist or complication that just sends everything spiraling down, mixed with a lot of gory sexuality and philosophical questions. Not every story is fantastic. Like any anthology, you'll read some stories and they're hit and miss for you. But I would say at least 2/3 of the 15 stories that I read here, I just thought were fantastic. And short story anthologies are great to read on the side because you can read a short story every night, every week, then put it away for a while and pick it back up. And it's not like a novel where you need to remember where you were, you're just starting a new story. So I've probably been reading the short stories in this anthology for 2 or 3 years now. And I've loved it the entire time. I've just taken my time with it. So for me, this is probably a 5 out of 5 for me. I can't recommend it enough. I think people should give short stories more chances because it is a very different method of storytelling. You have a very different experience with it. And Clive Barker is just one of the best there is for giving you this thriller, this disturbing story with interesting characters that leaves you feeling creepy afterwards. So do yourself a favor if you get the chance to read these books. Again, it's Clive Barker, Books of Blood, volumes 1 to 3. I will definitely pick up volumes 4 to 6 eventually. Okay, the last book I read was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. Sally Rooney is a household name now in the literary community. She is just gushed about because she writes in a somewhat different way. She doesn't use quotation marks, for example, and she's meant to give brilliant dialogue and very authentic conversations and analysis of characters. I would have to agree with this first book that she does all of these things. Her writing, it's poetical and interesting, it's sparse, and like Hemingway, doesn't overstay its welcome. You have very simple declarative sentences. So when she writes about sex, which fundamentally is what this book is about, and when she also writes about things like medical complications or broken hearts, you get very brief paragraphs and descriptions that are to the point and are precise and don't overstay their welcome. So I think her writing style is very neat. The prose is good. It's an easy book to read, and I think that's a mark of a great writer, that you can pick up a novel and read it quite easily, and it feels gentle on your mind and on your eyes. I know that sounds like an interesting description, but if you can read something and feel relaxed, and you start reading at 10 p.m. when you're in bed and suddenly it's midnight and you don't feel fatigued, you kind of want to keep going because you don't feel like you've exerted yourself, that is telling of a good author. And I had that experience a lot. But Conversations with Friends is a simple story about a girl and her best friend, and they become very embroiled with this married couple. And at first they're friends, and then the two of them sort of flirt and get a little bit romantically involved with this married couple. So what you have is drama, cheating potentially, definitely emotional cheating, and the sort of consequences that come from being too generous with your time and with your love with people you shouldn't be when you're in a committed relationship. And then a lot of questions about the ethical nature of this. Should you be doing this? Should you be telling your friends about this? How can you keep a secret like this? So it's a very modern story that's set in Dublin and centers around, you guessed it, conversations between friends. If I had to criticize this story, I would say that it still fits into this category of female wish fulfillment. Now, I read a lot of male wish fulfillment, so don't take this as a damning criticism, but you still have a story that is about a character who is described as dorky, potentially not even that pretty, but she is becoming romantically involved, and she becomes irresistible to this successful stud of an actor who is muscular and everybody thinks is incredibly handsome. But of course, like Twilight, like any YA, he is interested in this plain dorky girl. Now, again, that is an oversimplification. There's a lot of commentary on mental health and doubting oneself, and whether it's ethical to have a relationship between somebody who's older with somebody who's younger, or is it natural that somebody who's older should become infatuated with somebody who's younger and interested in them. So again, even though it is sort of female wish fulfillment, there is a lot of justification here that makes it a lot more significant than just that. So again, I quite enjoyed the story. I would say 3 to 4 stars. It's well written and it's easy to read, and I can see why Sally Rooney is so famous. Whoa, okay, so those are the 33 books that I have read. As you can see, it is a broad range from political non-fiction to horror short stories to a lot of fantasy fiction, literary fiction. I'm really pleased with myself that I was able to read so many books this year while working a full-time job that is much longer than your normal office hours. I'm pleased that I was able to read so many sophisticated books while also finding time to read middle grade children's books, because again, that is what I'm trying to focus on writing at the moment. I think my goal in 2021 is to read less adult literary fiction books, less epic fantasy. I think I'll try to read 10 or 15 overall, but this year, 2022, I'm going to go hard on middle grade children's fiction because that is really what I want to dedicate myself to for a while, so I need to read into the genre. But for 2021, I was really pleased with my effort, and I hope if I spoke about these books that perhaps you're interested in them. Again, this isn't the best sort of video to review a book because I'm trying to be as brief as I can while giving some of these books the time that they deserve. But I would like to start making videos that really go in-depth into particular books, particular series, especially for fantasy epic series that I've really enjoyed reading. So I would like to say thank you for watching. I hope that this was entertaining for you, that it filled the void in your mind whilst you were doing something nice or good for yourself, like going for a walk or folding your laundry. I hope you had an okay 2021. It was an awful year for so many people, but I'm optimistic that 2022 will at least be a little bit better. So take care of yourself, keep washing your hands, and I wish you all the best for next year. Thank you for watching.